Well, thank you very much, first of all, to Evan and Damien for inviting me here today, and thank you to all of you for coming out today to hear me speak, especially such a beautiful spring, summer day. It's very kind of you all to take the time to come out and listen to me. I'm very excited for several reasons to be here in Chicago. Actually, Chicago had a very interesting role in the process where I was researching this book. I came here in 2011 when President Hu Jintao came to the US. And it was a very interesting moment for me because he'd been in Washington before, the day before, and he had a very, very cold reception there. It would give me a sort of sense of the kind of growing anxiety in Washington about this rising China. There had been a state dinner at the White House, President Obama put on for him, and no one from Congress turned up. The majority leader, minority leader, leader of the House, no one turned up. Next day he came to Chicago, and at the time it was Mayor Daley, absolutely put out the red carpet for him. It was a completely different reception, a very excited reception here. And you got a sense of how outside of Washington people have a much more different view of China and the potential for investment and FDI to really shift the nature of the relationship. And I will get into a bit of that with my remarks. But that was a very kind of important moment for me, understanding the way that the US thinks about China. I'm also very glad to be here because the only previous two times I've been to Chicago have been in January and February. And so I did promise myself that I would jump at the next chance I got to come when it wasn't absolutely minus 20 outside and actually get to enjoy the city. So I'm very glad to be here for that reason. And then finally, I'm glad to be here because it's great to get a chance to talk about China. As Evan mentioned, my job is now in Washington covering American foreign policy. And when I moved there, I thought, well, I'll be kind of 50% Asia and 50% Middle East. And basically, it's Middle East morning, day and night, and Asia barely gets a look in. So it's great to have this chance to talk about some of these Asian issues and talk about China with you all today. As I mentioned, I did have this book that came out last year, and the underlying theme, as the rather dramatic title, Contest of the Century suggests, is that I do think we're entering into an era of what I call geopolitical competition between the US and China. So I want to talk to you a little bit about that today, but also about some of the questions that were raised when I was initially doing the book tour last year when the book came out, because I think often it's even once you've written a long book on something, it's the questions that really force you to clarify what you think and force you to really think through your thoughts. And often the simple questions are the very best questions. So I thought I'd just start out with just asking the simplest of simple questions. What is it that China really wants these days? We're reading a lot in the newspapers these days about a more ambitious and more assertive, sometimes even more aggressive China. And so I wanted to just try and nail down for a few minutes just what I think it is that China actually wants and what it's trying to achieve. And one way I'd try to explain that is to say that actually China has two different foreign policies in a way. It has like an economic and diplomatic foreign policy, and it has a military strategy as well. And these are two actually very different ways of thinking about the world and thinking about Chinese interests. The diplomatic economic part of it is really, it's the old Deng Xiaoping strategy. It's the idea that domestic growth is our main priority, that we have to grow our economy and grow our society and improve living standards. To do that, we need a peaceful regional environment. We need to insert ourselves into the manufacturing networks that have sprung up in Asia over the last few decades. And so we need to be on as good a terms as possible as we can be with our neighbors. That's the way that we, China, can really boost our prosperity and boost our standard of living and boost our economy. And this is the China of some of the people call smile diplomacy, of the charm offensive, the idea of peaceful rise. It was a China that in the late 90s, early 2000s, very skillfully took advantage of a strong anti-US backlash in the region after the Asian financial crisis, 97-98. And China presented itself to the rest of the region as this very reliable partner. And one result of this is that China, throughout the 1990s and 2000s, settled a whole series of potentially quite toxic and difficult land disputes, land borders. Settled all those disputes as one way of getting on better with its neighbors. So when we hear all these disputes about China's maritime claims, it's important to understand that there were a lot of very politically charged land border disputes, almost all of which China has managed to resolve in the previous decades. And this was an incredibly successful strategy. For much of the late 1990s and 2000s, China did very well with this Deng Xiaoping model of just keeping your head down, getting on well with the neighbors, and boosting your economy. And in an odd way, Xi Jinping at the moment is somehow trying to recreate elements of that with the new approach, the one road, one belt approach that you've probably read up in the papers recently about this whole idea of much bigger Chinese investment in various infrastructure projects around the region and trying to bind these other countries into China's economic sphere. In some ways, he's trying to recreate that impetus, that the way that China can do well is by engaging its neighbors in economic terms, using economics as a diplomatic tool. So that's one bit of China's strategy. But the other bit is this military strategy, which has really has always been there, but it's really taken off, I think, since 2008. And this is what I describe as great power China. We always talk about a rising China. This is the phrase we always use to describe China. But in an important way, in the last few years, China has already risen. And it's now trying to throw its weight around a little bit, throw its weight around a bit more in the world. And it's trying to make its claim and say, this is our moment, this is when we want to be paid attention to, this is when we want to start influencing and shaping the world more to our ends. This is a China that looks out to sees itself as being very vulnerable. So there's an insecurity behind this way that China thinks about itself. It's not just about ambition and about assertiveness, it also reflects a certain insecurity. So when China thinks of historically, it was from the sea that China was attacked by the British and the French and other colonial powers. Geographically, China feels vulnerable. It looks out to sea and it sees this kind of ring of territory around China that's all American allies, from Japan and South Korea down to the Philippines. And it's a China that feels vulnerable, that if things really, really got very sketchy with the US and sketchy with other powers, that China could be vulnerable to an economic blockade of some way. So now that China has this large navy, it is in some ways trying to use that tool to shape the balance of power in the region more to its favor. It wants to slowly push the US further out to sea, further out into the Western Pacific, make it harder for the US Navy to interfere or get involved if ever there was a conflict in the region. And at the same time as it's chipping away at American dominance, it's also slowly asserting its control in a whole series of features within those seas, and trying to stake its claim to the Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea. And then all these series of land building ventures you're seeing in the South China Sea, where China is trying to stake a claim through those bits of land, stake a broader claim to control of those seas. It's really making its claim one little land feature, one uninhabited island at a time. It's a very slow, deliberate, but disciplined strategy to increase its influence on these maritime areas. I think one way to think about it, in journalistic terms, it's a below-the-fold strategy. When Russia takes on the US, it wants to get your attention. It wants to be on the front page of the New York Times. It wants the US to see that it's standing up to it. So when Russia takes control of Crimea, this is a huge international event that is broadly publicized around the world. China is trying to do it in a much more low-profile, more subtle kind of way. It does get written about in the papers, but it's not on the front page. It's on the bottom of page A14. So when China has a dispute over the Scarborough Shoal, or when China's building up putting sand on some reef in the South China Sea, this is something that does get noticed, but not in a very dramatic way. And so hopefully China hopes that it won't encourage a broader backlash against it if it does it in this very slow and cautious way. And over time, China hopes that once its neighbors realize that they have to militarily to defer to China, that then once it has that kind of hold over them in terms of dominating these maritime areas and the sense that it's changed the military balance of power in the region, it hopes that slowly those countries will start to defer to it on other areas, on economic areas, trade issues, and maybe even on politics. Why has this really happened now? Well, I think there are lots of reasons. These tensions have been building up for a long time in China. But I think it's often framed, particularly in the discussion in the US at the moment, as being the result of the new president, Xi Jinping, who is more openly nationalist and more personally has a more personal swagger than his predecessor. But I don't think actually Xi Jinping is the real reason for this. I think if there is one event that has really pushed China down this direction, it was the financial crisis in 2008. Because that, I think, flicked a switch in the Chinese mind. There had always been this debate in China about what to do when it's a powerful country. And the Chinese hawk said, we will have to take on the US, we will have to push back against the US. That's the way that we will be a great power, that's the way we will expand our interests. And the Chinese dove said that no, we need to keep our head down and focus on integrating into the US order, into the global economy, and that's our path to success. But that was always a debate about the future, about the day when we become powerful. And what happened with the financial crisis is that it brought that up to the present and the now. Lots of people in China, particularly the Chinese hawks, said, you know what, US is in decline, this is our moment, this is when we need to start pushing back, this is our time. And it's really the financial crisis is the moment that really kind of triggered this process and really animated this more military strategy. So the big question that this raises is, do these two approaches to the world, are they contradictory or not? Are they sustainable on their own grounds? The Chinese would say that they're not necessarily contradictory. They would say that, you know, if the other Asian countries over time, if they feel so tied in to the Chinese economy, if they feel so dependent on demand from China and trade from China, investment from China, then they will have no choice but to accept this new military muscle, this more assertive Chinese military foreign policy. And maybe in the long run, maybe that is the way that things will play out. But over the past few years, I think it's been a very self-defeating approach. China has in lots of ways really shot itself in the foot. And we like to talk in the US always about the Obama administration's pivot to Asia. But the really important thing that's happened in Asia is the backlash that China has generated against itself over the last 5 years. From Japan, South Korea, but the Philippines and Vietnam, all of China's neighbors have started to get very worried and very anxious about what a powerful China will mean. And so the result is that the harder that China pushes back against the US and the harder that China stakes these territorial claims, the more these other countries fall back into the US arms, the more they call on the US to help them, the more they are much more embracing their alliances and their relationships with the US. So in the most dramatic example, one of the most striking examples, you have a country like Vietnam, which is at war with the US only 3 or 4 decades ago. The US is now selling Vietnam arms to try and boost its military to be able to push back against China. So that then leads the question, if this is such a self-defeating strategy, why is China doing this? And I guess the answer I would put to that is that one can think about the way China is behaving in terms of policies, in terms of strategies. But I think ultimately what's underlying this is actually something I'd call an instinct. It's not really a strategy, it's an instinct. And that instinct is, I think it's broadly applicable to a lot of the Chinese elite, a lot of the military, a lot of what the senior Communist Party officials think. So they believe that ultimately China's natural place in the world is to be the dominant power in Asia. They think historically that is the natural order of things. And this period for the last 60, 70 years where America has been the great power in the Western Pacific, they see that as something of a blip, an interlude whose time is now gradually going to come to an end. So I think it's that instinct that is ultimately driving a lot of what China's doing and the way that China acts and the way that it responds to certain events and the way it's behaving. Now that means a couple of things for the US, both good and bad. The good thing about that is that an instinct is not the same as a plan. This is not a series of Chinese 5-year plans for Asian domination. There isn't a detailed blueprint of how they want to get from A to B to C to D. That does mean there is some flexibility. It means there is potential for some negotiation. There aren't, China's objectives are not completely fixed in stone. The downside is that an instinct is a pretty powerful thing to deal with. And so it's very hard to divert a country from something that feels as an instinct. And so it's going to be quite hard for the US to get China off this path. It's fairly kind of locked in to that broader objective. So that's a bit of what I think China wants and China's thinking. The obvious question that raises is, where does this then leave the US? How is the US going to respond to that? How can the US respond to that? And I think the first thing to say is, at a very broad level, the US also has in some ways 2 different policies towards China, or at least 2 different Asia policies. They're also in their own way starting to conflict with each other. The first US approach to China is that, and this has been the case since Richard Nixon met Mao, widely shared across the foreign policy elite, is the idea that the US should try and have the best possible relationship it can with China, even given the huge gaps in terms of ideology, political system, outlook. Given all that, there is this deep-seated desire from the US foreign policy elite to try and get on with China. It's the idea that the responsibility of the US foreign policy elite is to avoid the Thucydides trap. This notion that somehow the existing great power, the status quo great power, and the rising great power are almost destined to fight each other. The US wants to do whatever it can to try and avoid that in the long run, and that's a fairly coherent objective of US policy since the 1970s, since Nixon met Mao. But that does clash with the second overriding US strategy for Asia, which has arguably been in place at least since the Second World War, but probably since Teddy Roosevelt. And that is that the US objective in Asia is to avoid any other country becoming the dominant power. It's to try and maintain a balance of power and to prevent any other country from being dominant. And China's rise and this accumulation of power and the development of its military, these are all beginning to challenge that concept and beginning to raise a possible threat to that way of thinking about the world. So these two US objectives are also beginning to collide in an important way. So how should Washington respond? How should the US government respond? Well, any conversation you have about American strategy, I mean, it actually tends to be between a fairly narrow bound. I mean, there are fairly kind of very accepted set of ideas. It's ultimately some sort of mixture of engaging China and hedging against this more powerful China. Any US strategy always involves a little bit of both. But there are now beginning to emerge fairly substantial differences in emphasis the way that some people are thinking about how to deal with China. I identify three different really main schools of thought. And I'll just kind of quickly go through them. I call them kind of Western thinking about China rather than necessarily American thinking about China, not because I'm a Brit, but simply for the reason that it turns out a lot of Australians are coming up with some of the very best ideas on this front. So it's not just about how America's thinking, but it's also about how lots of other countries are thinking too. But ultimately, it's about American strategy. The first line of thought would be what I call the balancers, and these are, if you like, the slightly more hawkish people within the American establishment. And their argument is you need a much more robust US coordinated effort to balance this rising power in China. One of the most striking statements of this is a recent Council on Foreign Relations report by a guy called Ashley Tellis, another one called Robert Blackwell, which is very well worth a read if you're interested in this. And they essentially say a couple of main things. First of all, more military presence in the region, stepped up military spending, a lot more military assets there to counteract this growing Chinese presence. But also the really interesting bit about their argument is that they're starting to suggest that the US should throw a little bit of sand in the wheels of the Chinese economy. People sometimes use the phrase containment to talk about US approach to China, and that's never that's never really described what the US is doing or should do. Containment would be something very different. Containment was what the US did against the Soviet Union, where the Warsaw Pact was completely walled off from the rest of the global economy. Containment against China would be for the US to be going to Australia and saying, you know what, you guys shouldn't sell your iron ore to the Chinese, why don't you sell it to the Indians instead? That would be containment. That's not what the US has ever really thought about doing. But this report was one of the first few occasions where you're starting to see serious foreign policy thinkers in Washington say, you know, maybe we should just try and make life a little bit more difficult for the economy. So let's put more restrictions on technology transfers, especially ones where the technology has some sort of military use. Beginning to flirt with some of the tools of what might have been you thought of as a containment policy. I thought that's a kind of very interesting development that I hadn't really seen articulated closely before. The second school you might call the accommodationist school. It's more, if you like, the more dovish way of thinking. And there are two main strands. The first one was most clearly articulated by a book by Jim Steinberg, who was the Deputy Secretary of State in the first Obama administration, and Michael O'Hanlon at the Brookings Institution. And their idea is what they call strategic reassurance. And the idea is that the US should try to find ways to build confidence with China through essentially kind of old arms control types of measures, the kind of things that the US did with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Tried to find little strategies and little areas where you can build these confidence-building measures so that trust can be built between the two countries in these areas where they are big rivals. And then the second school of thought would be the most clearly articulated by an Australian writer called Hugh White. And he calls for essentially a grand bargain between the US and China. He says that the US and China should share power in Asia, that there should be essentially some big deal, if you like, between the US and China. They'd work out their view on Taiwan and North Korea. And essentially they'd come to a broad agreement of which they'd ultimately agree to be co-leaders and work out their differences in this big grand bargain. And that's leaning towards the idea that the US would essentially concede a certain sphere of influence to China in Asia that it's never really acknowledged before. And then the final school of thought is what I call the ballast school of thought. And that's more clearly articulated by Kevin Rudd, the former Australian Prime Minister. I told you Australians are very big on this stuff. They're very clearly engaged in these ideas. And his basic idea is that it's inevitable there's going to be very fierce rivalry between the US and China in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, in the Western Pacific. That's baked into the cake. But so what you need to do is find lots of ways to counterbalance that. You need to find other ways where the US and China can cooperate around the world that will create a broader sense of trust so that this rivalry, so these tensions in the South China Sea don't completely sandbag the rest of the relationship, don't drown out everything else, and don't completely dominate the discussion. And he talks a bunch of ideas. He talks about UN reform, about climate change, about giving China a bigger role in the World Bank and the IMF, things like that. But I would add another couple of things, like I think lots of ways that the US and China could work together in Africa, for instance. They're not destined to compete in Africa. And then another one would be to look at the whole area of foreign direct investment. I mean, for the Paulson Institute, this is probably one place in America where it's preaching to the converted. But there's a huge amount of, there's a huge way in which FDI could be a thing that binds the two countries together, finds another kind of layer of dependency and cooperation that gives a ballast to the relationship that allows you to have, so there's more in common so that these other tensions don't necessarily overwhelm everything else. So those are kind of brief outlines of 3 different ways that I think people are now very clearly starting to think about how to deal with China. So the question of who of these who is right, who's got the strongest argument? Well, the ballast argument is, I think it's, as I've kind of indicated, I think is absolutely a very valid way of thinking about it. And it should be pushed as far as it goes. And there are lots of ways that the US and China could do that. But it doesn't actually resolve the basic question, which is these very grinding, harsh tensions that are appearing in the Western Pacific, where you have these two navies that are jutting up against each other. It doesn't get you around those questions. It's a very good idea. It's something that should be invested in and looked into and worked on, but it doesn't ultimately resolve the question, which is ultimately how are you going to manage this rivalry in the Western Pacific? So let's look at the other 2 schools, the balancers. Have they got it right? I would say that the risk of this approach is that you take it too far, and that the US could end up shooting itself in the foot. The real sweet spot, the really important thing to think about in terms of Asian geopolitics is the US needs to avoid asking Asian countries to make a choice. It needs not to force them to choose between the US or China. When you start pushing them against the wall and asking them to make that kind of choice, that's when you're going to lose. China has been losing out very badly in the last few years, I think, because it was essentially trying to force these countries to make that choice, saying, you can't rely on the US, why don't you deal with us with whether it's pushing its territorial disputes. And that caused this backlash against China, caused these other countries to move towards the US. The US, I think, shot itself in the foot with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank when it told its allies not to join up to something that was bound to happen, was inevitably going to happen. And by forcing them against the wall, the US ended up in the worst possible position when all its allies ended up signing up anyway, and the US lost all its leverage over the debate. So the really important the sweet spot, the way that you want to frame your thinking, I think, is for the US not to be forcing a choice on its Asian allies and Asian partners. And the risk with this more aggressive type of approach where you're actually trying to suggest to some of these countries that maybe you shouldn't be selling certain types of technologies to the Chinese, is that you get this backlash that the Asian countries are not going to buy into that they're going to think that you're pushing them too far. And the worst place that the US can really end up is when it's just the US and Japan in Asia against China. That's a very weak position for the US. It needs to have a much broader range of support in the region if it is going to actually deal with China. And what about the accommodationists? Well, let's take these holiday of confidence-building measures. That too makes complete sense. The US should look into that. But I think there's very limited prospect for these types of arms control type agreements really to take place with China. And the reason for that is that one of China's big advantages is the idea of ambiguity, the idea of uncertainty. China is the weaker country. Its military is growing quickly. It's getting more powerful, but it's still a lot weaker than the US. When you are the weaker power, one of your trump cards is the uncertainty, is the idea that the other side doesn't quite know how you're going to behave in certain situations. And the Chinese have leveraged that kind of uncertainty very well in some of these areas in the last few years. So the Chinese are going to be reluctant to give that up through signing up certain agreements where the two countries establish rules of the road and establish patterns of behavior that might reduce some of the tensions. So I think there's only limited potential with that type of argument. And then the whole idea of a grand bargain. Well, again, that might theoretically seem appealing, but the biggest problem with that is that the US isn't actually in a position to deliver any of that. The only way that China can become a co-leader and a leader in Asia is if it earns it. The US can't bestow that title on China. China has to be able to convince its neighbors that it is a trusting, reliable partner. The US can't simply, through some sort of grand treaty bargain, give China that role on its own. And if the US tried to do that, it would generate a very powerful backlash against the Chinese and against itself. One way to think about that is that implicit in a lot of this Chinese thinking is that if it can just push the US aside, it's natural that China will take over this role as the dominant power in Asia. But that's not the way that the other Asians, I think, will react. We're in a very different world now, a very proud, dynamic nation states in Asia that also think that this is their time, that this is their century. And they do not want to be dominated by China. They would react against that. You'd start to see maybe a nuclear weapon in Japan, maybe even in South Korea. Vietnam rearming much more, maybe even a nuclear weapon in Vietnam. The end result of that type of approach is not this sort of new agreement where the US and China are co-leaders or China gradually becomes the hegemon. The end result is a rather uncertain, brittle Asia where these other countries are resentful of China and its power and are waiting for a moment for it to slip up. That's a much more uncertain, unstable type of environment, and it wouldn't be in the US interest to go down that path. So finally, just say how I think the US should approach it. Well, ultimately, in the coming decades, has to be some kind of accommodation between the US and China. So they have to find some sort of way to work together, some sort of sense of agreement as to where their legitimate influence lies and where it does not. But that's not something that can be reached at through some grand bargain. It's going to be something that will be reached very gradually, more subtly. And the important thing is on what terms that takes place. And so for me, the really important bit, the emphasis, if you like, over the next few years for the US should be on standing firm against China. That doesn't mean to say the US shouldn't be engaging, shouldn't be trying to find ways to work together with China. But the really big priority for the next decade or two is to reinforce to the Chinese that the US is not going anywhere. The US sees its future as intimately linked with Asia, sees its economic future and not just its military future as being tied to Asia. And that the US is not simply going to slink back to Hawaii anytime in the future and see that its time in Asia is up. And that's a tough thing to pull off. It's going to require changing the way the US talks about economics, talks about trade, talks about its economic links with the region. It's going to require TPP to go through. If that doesn't happen, the US will start to look very weak. And it's going to require a very disciplined, coherent follow-through on the diplomatic side as well. Very much getting over this idea that the US is just interested in the Middle East, but actually sees its diplomatic future very much in Asia too. But that ultimately is the way forward, is to get over this message that the US is absolutely committed to Asia not just for the next few years, but for its future. It sees that's the path to its future prosperity. And if it can do that, if it can convince the Chinese that the US still thinks that way, then it's in a much better position to start having these more difficult conversations and more difficult discussions about some new equilibrium, some new modus vivendi. That, to me, is what the idea of the pivot was really about. The pivot, which is this Obama administration policy, was launched a few years ago, got very distracted about what the word pivot means, got tied up in a lot of military discussion. But ultimately, the real idea, seemed to me, was the US trying to say, we're not going anywhere, we're here to stay. And that has to be the core US message. And if the US can get that right, then some of these other challenges will be much easier to resolve on US terms in the coming decades. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there, because you've heard me speak for way, way too long. And what I'd really like to do now is open up to your questions and hear your thoughts. Particularly, I see lots of Chinese students in the audience. I'd love to hear from you as well, if you do. So I will open up to questions. Gentleman there first, please.
It's a good presentation. Thank you very much. My name is Matt. I'm a business school and worked in aerospace and defense for one. You've mentioned a couple of things. You mentioned a couple of times worrying about China's military capabilities. I would say that it's somewhat hysterical that we worry about that as Americans, because we either sold it to them or they stole it from us. The Clinton administration sold for a $100 million campaign donation, the Chinese, through Israel, all of our guided missile, ballistic missile technology. I'm just have 2 comments. I have a question.
Sure.
And then I think instead of, excuse me, worrying about whether this is a golden age in China, we might ask, why isn't this a golden age in America? Instead of throwing sand at China, why aren't we building a garden back here in the United States? And I think a lot of that has to do with restructuring the incentives necessary for businesses to repatriate basic industry back here. One of those ideas is to lower corporate tax rates, for example, which I wrote about in your newspaper. Question, Russia. We're doing our best in America to induce a conflict with them, in my opinion, I think a lot of people's opinion. We're poised in the Baltics with effectively a whole division, and we're aggravating Russia and poking them, I think, a number of different provocative ways. What would China's reaction be if we have a formalized conflict with Russia, in your opinion? Thank you.
If there was a genuine conflict between China and Russia, that would be incredibly bad for Chinese interests, in as much it would be an incredibly destabilizing event, not just for Europe, but for the world as a whole. So the Chinese would not like to see that. But the level of tension that we have at the moment with this much more low-level conflict, if you want to call it, between the West and Russia, and certainly this diplomatic freeze between the two, has served Chinese interests fantastically well. The Crimea bit of the equation, the Chinese are very awkward about, because they don't like the idea about bits of territory being flipped from one country to another. They're very firm on the idea of territorial sovereignty. But all the other bits of it have favored the Chinese very well. So I mean, the clear thing to look at is the way that Russia, now that's isolated so much from the West, has been forced towards China, has been forced to move towards China and try and seek a much stronger relationship with Beijing. And the biggest symbol of that was a huge energy pipeline the two countries have been discussing really for a decade. There have been talk about the Chinese importing this gas from Russia. They've been haggling over price for a decade. It was only the Ukraine conflict that actually broke the deadlock and allowed China to sign that deal, probably on terms very favorable to it. So this much more lower level of tension and conflict between the West and Russia has served Chinese interests very well. It's essentially forced Russia to accept terms as a junior partner, if you like, towards China. In the long run, that's a very unnatural position for Russia. That shouldn't be the natural order of things. Russia and China should in lots of ways be rivals in many ways. There are lots of reasons why they're more likely to think of themselves as two great powers whose interests clash in Central Asia and clash in the Western Pacific. And indeed, before Ukraine, Russia was actually doing lots of things to slowly push back against China. So, for instance, one of the biggest things that's happened in the South China Sea conflict is that Vietnam has bought half a dozen very quiet submarines, which are given a much more effective hedge against Chinese influence in the South China Sea. It was Russia that sold them the submarines. So before the Ukraine incident, Russia was doing all these things that are actually very damaging to Chinese interests. All that is off for the time being. But I think once Putin leaves power, if there is, which could take a number of years to happen, but once that does happen, and if there is a sort of gradual mending of ties between Russia and the West, the more natural dynamic is for Russia and China to be more rivals than partners. But in the meantime, Russia is being forced into a more supplicant position because it needs friends, and so China is the big beneficiary. I don't know if that answers your question. Your first point about the economy, I don't necessarily want to go into corporate tax rates, but is absolutely true. I mean, it's almost so obvious that one shouldn't need to say it, but one does need to say it, that the US will only be able to really deal with China, to be able to compete and to stand up and engage with China on favorable terms if it does have a dynamic, growing economy in the coming years. And if the US does stagnate, then its ability to deal with China will be severely limited. I mean, it's almost so obvious one shouldn't need to say it, but it is absolutely true.
I'd add the UK as well.
Well, let's not get onto the UK. That's a whole other story. But yes, thank you.
Thank you for your talk. I have more of a journalism question.
Sure.
Relating to your experience in China. What are some of the, when we see issues of journalistic integrity, we see outlets like the New York Times, which I think it certainly in their view they think that they're sticking true to their guns and as a result have been kicked out of China, versus maybe a Bloomberg, which there's been reports of story killing by editors to appease Beijing. How do you strike that balance? Because on the one hand, you want to report the stories that are interesting to you and to your readers, but at the same time, if you're not there, you're not going to have influence. So how do you balance those choices?
It's a very good question. I think Evan actually summed up the situation incredibly well. This is a very, very tough period to be a journalist and foreign journalist in China. The authorities are much more heavy-handed in the way they're dealing with journalists. And that stretches from not allowing visas to certain people to actual much more intimidation on the ground. But at the same time, it is a golden age of journalism. And those reports that Bloomberg did about Xi Jinping's family and the New York Times has done about Wen Jiabao's family and other Chinese leaders were extraordinary pieces of investigative journalism that would never have seen the light of day, and it revealed very important information about how China works. And a kind of journalism that people had never really done before. They actually worked out that the interesting sub-story on this is that Hong Kong is the weak link, because so much of Chinese wealth is managed or funneled or engages with Hong Kong. And the disclosure rules in Hong Kong are so very different than in mainland China that the journalists worked out if they looked in the right kind of bond prospectuses and the right documents in Hong Kong, you could find all sorts of information that you could ultimately link back to these big families. And so there's a whole genre of journalism that we'd never really had before that has exposed, shone a real light on the powerful families in China, how they behaved and how they looked after themselves. That's very valuable and very important. To your question about how to deal with that, well, in a way, the way the different companies have behaved is fairly understandable when you think of them as businesses. Bloomberg actually has a huge business in China. It sells lots of terminals or rents lots of terminals to banks and other investors in China. So it's very vulnerable to the Chinese government cutting them off. The New York Times has a basically minimal business in China. It had started a Chinese language website. It has ambitions to grow that over the years and thinks it could have an audience there, but it doesn't make any money in China. And so there's no corporate vulnerability or liability there. So it can afford to be more aggressive and has continued, to its very great credit, has continued to be very, very aggressive. Bloomberg has damaged itself in an important way. It's a very difficult situation because on the one hand it has this business vulnerability there, but on the other hand its whole service is dependent on the idea that you trust the information they're telling you about China. And so there's a question mark about, and other economies, but particularly about China, but in this case about China. And the way they behave does raise questions about whether they're actually telling you all they know or whether they're holding things back. And that is a problem, that is an issue for them. But the much bigger issue is losing out the Chinese market. And so I think it's understandable, if regrettable, the way that they ultimately behaved. Sir, if you just wait for the microphone.
I wonder what you think the United States policy toward Iran, what influence that would have on the relationship with China. And just to pose it as two alternative futures, if an Iran nuclear deal leads to an Iran that has a certain amount of openness and hence a more dynamic economy, but continues or develops a resilient authoritarian system, which would be in its own way similar to Chinese resilient authoritarian system. This could be a natural ally of China that sought to establish a revisionist international system more favorable to authoritarian regimes. Or on the other hand, and eventually getting a nuclear deterrent, or more hardline policy which insisted on less nuclear capability of Iran and kept more pressure on the regime until it evolved, so that it would, well, not create such an ally for a change of what the international norms would be. But doing that would require holding together a coalition that China might be willing to be part of to prevent actual nuclear proliferation. Right. So there's a kind of dilemma there.
That's a very interesting question. Let me come at it a couple of different ways. The first thing is to say that China has been a very reliable partner of the US and the Europeans in these nuclear negotiations. It has held the line. It hasn't been trying to freelance. It hasn't been trying to cut its own deals. And that ultimately comes down to the fact that it's in China's interest not to have a nuclear-armed Iran, because that would cause so much instability in the rest of the Middle East, a region where China gets so much of its oil from. So China's been a very kind of reliable partner on this nuclear issue. The second issue you raised about what would then happen if there is a deal. Does Iran start to open up? Does China start to invest a lot? The Chinese would probably like to, but actually there's a bit of a back history there where the Chinese have signed a whole series of sort of semi-deals with Iran over the years on energy. I mean, billions of dollars of deals, and very few of them have been realized because the Iranians were very difficult customers to deal with. And the Chinese got cold feet, and they pulled out and have got very reluctant to invest in Iran. So they will try to go into Iran if there's a deal, but they're not going to rush in, I suspect, because actually they understand that Iran's a very difficult place to operate. But your third and very interesting question about would they be authoritarian allies? I think the way to think about the way China thinks about this is to say China's not trying to turn the world authoritarian. It's not trying to impose its system on another country, but it is trying to make the world safe for its system. So it's not necessarily trying to dictate the terms of what kind of regime operates in Iran, but it does want to prevent a situation where US pressure from the internet and civil society sponsored by an Iranian-American diaspora in this country, that kind of dynamic, the sort of color revolution dynamic, would be introduced into a country like Iran and change the regime. China would be very opposed to that kind of dynamic because it fears ultimately that that kind of dynamic could work in its own country. So from that point of view, it would see an ideological interest or companionship with an Iranian regime, but not in the sense that it's actually going to actively try and work in a way to create a set of political arrangements in Iran. It's more a sort of negative type of operation where it wants to make sure that Iran is not vulnerable to that kind of Americanizing, westernizing, democratic pressure, if that makes sense or not.
Well, it seems like it is a kind of dilemma that in the short term, the United States could get a lot of cooperation with China to use sanctions to get more concessions from Iran, but that would also put a lot of pressure on the Iran regime that China might not want to do. So it's a dilemma for the United States and for China.
I mean, this whole question of what a nuclear deal would do to the Iranian regime is an incredibly interesting one, and I think it's a very open question, but it's something that's absolutely very powerful in Washington at the moment. And I think one of the one person who actually thinks that a nuclear deal could unlock political change of a more westernizing type of, or at least a liberalizing type in Iran, is actually President Obama. I think most people in Washington are very skeptical about that idea. But I think he's on record on several occasions as suggesting that actually he thinks that if you get the nuclear deal, it will change the internal dynamics in the Iranian regime, and you will start to see a different type of politics emerge. Not a democracy, but certainly one that's more, at least less hostile to the West, a different type of system where it's a bit more accountable to this kind of middle-class population that wants to be part of the world and be more favorable to Western interests. And it is true that China might see that as being something that it's not particularly keen on, but I don't think that's ultimately what's driving their behavior in Iran. I think they are pretty focused on the nuclear issue and the potential for that to cause instability in the region. Gentleman there in the blue shirt at the back, please.
Thanks for your talk. My name is Lear, and I'm a fourth year in the college. So there seems to be a general consensus that some kind of accommodation needs to be made to China. Is there a risk that any kind of concession will just embolden the Chinese and kind of confirm their view that the U.S. is a country in decline and is scrambling in the region?
That is the very tricky balancing act that the U.S. has to play when it's dealing with this issue. If you seem too eager to do some kind of deal to be acknowledging China's legitimate concerns, if you're too keen to do that, the Chinese will just think that you're packing up and going away, and that this is a sign of weakness. So what I was trying to suggest, my concluding remarks, is that if the U.S. is to have those kind of conversations with China, it has to try and do it from a position of strength. And that position of strength is an understanding in China and the US that the US is there to stay in the region, that it's not about to disappear, to slink back to Hawaii. Once you have that broad understanding, then it's much easier to have those kinds of conversations with the Chinese without them necessarily thinking that you're a pushover. So it's getting that messaging, that signaling right. If you can do that, then those other conversations become a little bit easier. Not easy, but a little bit easier. There's a lady in the front here, that second row.
Thank you. Would the United States trust the Chinese government more, or in other words, be less concerned about China's rise if China were a democracy? Or would the US be equally wary of any emerging nation that could challenge its singular superpower status, regardless of its form of government? Thank you.
That's a brilliant question. Two things to that. The first thing is, my broader view is that if China had the Swedish political system, let's just imagine that happened tomorrow. Most of the things that China's doing in its foreign policy, it would be doing so anyway. Because the things that it's doing are actually not, to me, ultimately motivated by its political system or even the sense of threat that the political elite feel in China. Ultimately, it's motivated by history and geography. And lots of the things that China is doing at the moment are precisely the way that the US thought about its own situation 120 years ago in the 1890s, when it built its own navy and started actually setting up its own sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere. So I think it's much more rooted in, if you like, geopolitics and geoeconomics and not necessarily in ideology. Although that clearly is part of the fabric of mistrust between the two systems and the two leaders. I don't want to completely dismiss it, but I think it's goes much deeper than that. The second point is I mean, actually think about if the political system in China did change, a lot of that, and the way that affected foreign policy would depend obviously in lots of ways on how that came about. But the most likely scenario to me is that at least in the medium term, you might get a much more nationalist China, at least during this process of transition and political change. Because how else are you going to outflank the Chinese Communist Party? How are you going to gain legitimacy and traction in a system where they've dominated for so long? The only bit of like the political spectrum that they don't completely dominate is that sort of nationalist rhetoric. And so if you did start to see space opening up in the Chinese political system for someone to challenge the party, it seems to me almost inevitable that they would latch onto a lot of these nationalist narratives about Japan, about the US. And so it could be more unstable as China went through that transition rather than more stable. I think there'd be, and that's not to say that that's necessarily a bad thing that China ends up with a different political system, but the process could be a very tricky one, a very messy one, and a very complicated one for foreign policy. The lady there, please, in the second row.
My question just has to do with the role of India in the U.S. and Chinese relationship, whether it is as sand in the wheels, as you put it, to one or the other party, or as potentially its own power in its own right.
So I think the way to think about India is that at the moment, the last thing that India wants to be is if you like, a US ally in balancing or checking against China. India is worried about some of the Chinese influence. It's concerned. And so it's subtly hedging its bets by having a good relationship with the US, having a good relationship with the Japanese, having a good relationship with other Asian countries. But it doesn't want to be openly in alliance with the US and trying to balance China. But I think the thing to watch is what China does in the Indian Ocean. At the moment, the Chinese Navy is essentially basically focused on the Western Pacific, on the South China Sea and the East China Sea. Both the naval assets and the missiles that China's developed are focused on those areas. It hasn't yet made the decision really as to whether it wants a real blue water navy that would allow it to have a much more global reach. But if you think about China's economic vulnerability, it is the oil flows that come down from the Gulf, that come down past in Pakistan, past India, through the Indian Ocean, and then on up through the South China Sea up into China. If China really started thinking that we want to have a kind of navy that can control that whole chain of trade, and so a navy that really stretched up into the Indian Ocean, up into the Gulf, then you'd start to rattle India a lot more, because then they'd start thinking much more about having bases in Sri Lanka or Pakistan, or having a much more permanent naval presence in the Indian Ocean. The single thing that I think would change an Indian calculus would be a Chinese naval base in Pakistan. I mean, it's hard to think of something that would rattle the Indian strategic instinct more than that. So that's the thing to really watch for. And if you start to see China investing very heavily in that kind of presence, and therefore cultivating much closer ties with countries like Pakistan or Sri Lanka and thinking of having permanent naval bases in those countries, then I think you would start to see India shift and become much more willing to be a partner, not an ally, but a partner of the US in trying to balance China. Gentleman there in the white shirt, please.
Thank you. I would like to hear your opinion on the apparent brain drain that's occurring with many of the Chinese talents and students going over to the US, for example, to study and hoping to become naturalized and rarely ever go back to the States. I mean, this is, of course, a sort of a stereotype, but it seems to me that this lack of cross-educational exchange is the cause of a lot of the tensions that are happening between China and the rest of the world. When taking into account that many of the founders and leaders of the Republic of China and even the People's Republic of China in decades before have studied in foreign countries, have certainly improved relations. For example, we can think of many of the foreign ministers in the 1980s and 70s who have personally studied in Japan decades before and have made Japanese friends and American friends. And that period was, to me, it seems to be the honeymoon period between in foreign relations history in China. And although now with the current foreign minister in China, Wang Yi, who studied Japanese language, who was the ambassador of Japan and so forth, he seems to lack that personal connection with Japan that made tensions between China and Japan as tense as ever. So I was just wondering of your opinion on the lack of cross-educational exchange between the top political leaders of countries and of course the brain drain in the student populations of both countries, and whether that has impinged on the foreign relations between the two countries.
So there's several interesting questions within that. I guess the first thing to say is that while clearly I think people in the West have overstated the impact of having a lot of Chinese people coming studying in this country and then moving back to China would be on the politics of China. I think people have overstated that. They haven't proved to be this Trojan horse that's pushing for political liberalization in China. It still has to be clearly a good thing for relations between the two countries that you have these people that do have an intimate experience of both countries. That has to fundamentally be a very positive thing and a valuable thing to have with these two countries that are going to have this rivalry, to have this deep interconnection has to be an important thing. But I think the second part of your remarks really hit on something quite powerful, is the complete, I don't want to use the word ignorance, but the complete insulation of debate within China about Japan and Japanese society, and almost the sort of surreality of it, if you like. The way it's really kind of detached from what's actually happening in Japan, the way Japanese really think and behave. And that has to partly be based on the rather shallow and much shallower contacts there are between the two countries in terms of these kinds of people exchanges. There are lots of Japanese who've worked in China, but many fewer Chinese who've had exposure to Japan. That really is a weak spot, I think, if you like, and something where much more broader exchanges could subtly help the relations between the two countries. I don't know, I'm not sure that really answers your question, but anyway, I hope I tried to. Anyway, next question. Gentleman there in the purple shirt. Is the microphone coming your way? Yes.
Thank you very much for this very interesting talk. Well, it seems like in the past several months, there was a growing concern about the Chinese hawks, the role they're playing in the Chinese policy making. And I'm glad you brought up the financial crisis in 2008. Yet for me, the financial crisis in 2008, as well as the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, served a broad role in the so-called sea change of Chinese viewing America. Well, basically, in 1980 and 1990s, America served basically a role model of modern society for Chinese people, many Chinese people, including some hawks. And then after, the Iraq War, Afghanistan, and financial crisis, there was some growing feeling that maybe that's not okay, we shouldn't hold up America that high, in our mentality. So there was change in this mentality. It's not even related to whether or not United States should go to Iraq, but how things gets done there. So U.S. is no longer, a nation, a country who has it all figured out. But this mentality change is reflected even in his less publicized talks, including his talk in Confucius Institute in Shandong. It was like previously we thought America's model is really good, and then so and so things happened, and then we realized Confucius should something we should go for. So this sea change in mentality. My question is it? Do you observe that in the broader population in China, or it's just some illusion? I mean, propaganda, by the government. Thank you.
Again, very interesting question. And I think your point about the idea of the US as a role model is a very important one. And it's not just about China. I mean, this is really across the world where the very big mistakes the US has made over the last 15 years have severely impacted its prestige and its attractiveness as a model. This is something that people in Britain, frankly, think as well. It's not just related just to China. It is, but the Iraq War and the financial crisis had a powerful effect on the way that people around the world think about the US and think about its capabilities and capacity to change. And so as I answered a question before, America's ability to deal with China is fundamentally linked to its ability to have a strong economy, not just because of the resources that will give America to invest in its military, but also because of the sense of success and competency that will project around the world is absolutely fundamental for underpinning its foreign policy, for underpinning its reliability and capacity as an actor in the world. But one final point I'd say is that while I think these views about American decline were very widely held in China, 2008, 2009, are still quite widely held in China. I think Chinese people in general have a very ambivalent attitude towards the US. I mean, they're still very, they can be very disrespectful and are very admiring to the US simultaneously. So I think if you had an audience of Chinese students in front of us at a Chinese university in Beijing, and you ask them, do you admire the US? Do you think American political system is a good model for the US? Most of them would probably say no. But then if you offer them a job at JP Morgan tomorrow in New York, almost all of them would say yes. And they'd say yes because that's still the kind of badge of success, the idea that you could go to this very prestige brand name institution and be a success of that in New York. That's still the kind of pinnacle of modernity to a Chinese middle-class person. That's still the path of a really successful person. And so there still is that sense that the US, while it's lost some of its image has been tarnished, it still is ultimately still the main power. It still is the kind of shining light for them, even though it's not quite the way it used to be.
Thank you.
More questions, please. Gentleman here in the front, if you think there will be a microphone, if just give us 1 second. Right here in the front, please.
I think, the only historian here. I'm in the history department, and in that capacity, I'd like to observe that not only was your presentation excellent, and not just because I agreed with all of it, but also I, as a historian, would observe that those 2 points you made about the watershed nature of 2008 and use of the word instinct in describing this assumption that China would, an expectation of a new Sino-centrality, especially acute. My question is somewhat related to the point just raised. It was mentioned Xi Jinping's address at Chufu, but that was just one of many statements that he had made last fall concerning Chinese traditional culture, concerning the place of the classics in education, Confucianism, etc. Do you think that that series of statements is related in any way to a larger vision of China's future? And what does it bode?
So I think there's a cynical way of thinking about this adoption of the Chinese classics and a and then a more interesting way of thinking about it. The cynical way is that the Chinese Communist Party has lost, over the last few decades, has lost a lot of the vestiges of its legitimacy. Simply as left-wing ideology and ideas and Marxism have been discredited and has been forced to adopt market economics. And so it's been searching around for other ideological buttresses to maintain its legitimacy. The growth in nationalism is one of it. The record of economic competence is still the main part of it. But this attempt to kind of embrace and look into Chinese ancient history and Chinese classical traditions is another part of it. It's part of the Communist Party trying to say, you know, we're not actually this revolutionary left-wing ideology. We are the inheritors of this wonderful, great, deep Chinese tradition, and that makes us a much more legitimate government if they can do that. That's, if you like, the cynical bit of that. The interesting bit of that is that as China has been feeling its oats around the world the last few years, has felt that this is our time, you're starting to see lots of Chinese intellectuals thinking about what it means in intellectual terms for China to be a world power. What does China want intellectually to do with that? What are the ideas that China hopes to inspire the world with? What does it mean to be a Chinese great power? How is that different from the kind of ideas that America represent? And so you've seen lots of Chinese intellectuals trying to dip into these kind of traditions to try and project ideas that give a distinct Chinese identity to this new Chinese great power. And that is something I think is very important, something to watch very closely, because it's going to underpin in some of the ways that China both behaves, but also the way that the Chinese leadership explain their behavior to the Chinese population. Because they're not going to actually, you know, we as kind of Westerners rooted in like a European Anglosphere history understand China in terms of great powers and the way that maybe Germany behaved in the 19th century. Those are not the analogies the Chinese are going to use to describe themselves. They're going to dip much more into Chinese history and Chinese traditions. And so the kind of stories that they try to tell about themselves are going to be very important for us understanding what they're really thinking and how they're going to behave. And so I think it's not just a cynical thing. I think there's actually something very valuable and interesting that we should pay attention to there. Gentleman with the green at the back there.
In your judgment, have adequate safeguards been installed in the Chinese financial sector in order to ward off a crisis, especially given the internationalization of parts of the sector and the currency? And then relatedly, are there any successes regarding Chinese management of its financial sector that could be brought to the West helpfully? I'm sort of scrambling on the second question because I've never been answered that before, and I've never even thought about it before, so I'm struggling to come up with an answer. But the first one is a very important point, and I think there's a very pessimistic mood about the Chinese economy at the moment. A lot of people suggesting that they're on the verge of some kind of implosion. There's essentially too much debt, that the system's overlogged with debt, there's a property bubble, and the system's about to implode. And I think that misunderstands the Chinese financial system. I think it's very unlikely that you'll get a financial crisis in China of the nature that the US and the UK and the West experienced in 2007. You're not going to get financial institutions collapsing in the same way, simply because the state, even though things have liberalized a bit, the state still controls too many levers. So they can intervene and move liquidity around in important ways and instruct people to do certain things in ways that prevent that kind of implosion, that type of crisis. You're not going to get bank runs. You're not going to get big banks that wake up in the morning and find they don't have any capital left. The state can massage the system to prevent that type of crisis. What you can get, and what you might still get in China, is a kind of slow strangulation through this overhang of debt, where it means that the economy is saturated. There aren't enough investment opportunities around. Debt, you have to keep on issuing debt to pay off bad debts that have accumulated. So the system becomes much less inefficient, productivity goes down over a number of years, and you get a slow decline in growth. That is the risk that the big debt overhang that China has built up in the last few years is going to create. It's of a slow deterioration and dynamism. It's not of a kind of Lehman Brothers collapse type of crisis. And just one statistic to explain that for you. When the financial crisis hit in the US, the way it went from Lehman Brothers to the broader economy was that credit markets froze up. Banks became mistrustful and didn't want to lend to each other. And so in 2008, 2009, you had a significant reduction in the amount of credit being awarded in the economy. In China, in 2009, bank lending doubled. And doubled because the government essentially told the banks to go out and lend. So even though you have had important liberalizations even since then, and the system has been opened up in big ways, the state still is dominant enough within the system that it can make the big things happen when it needs to prevent these kind of accidents.
Hey, Geoff, why don't you take 2 more?
Okay. Gentleman there in the second row.
Not sure I've heard of any other journalist having a background in Brazil or being stationed in Brazil and China, and so I'd like to ask you, are there similarities, continuities, discontinuities, more impressionistically on the day-to-day living as opposed to the geopolitics for those two countries?
Don't compare the each other.
Yeah. So experience as a journalist was just completely different. Brazil is very like the United States in the sense it's a very, very open country. It's a country of immigrants. Everyone wants to tell you their life story. Everyone wants to talk to you. The government was very open at the time as well, if you're a foreign journalist. And so I had a very good friend, when I was in Brazil, a very good friend who was a correspondent in China. And I would describe to him my life. I mean, as the FT correspondent in Brazil, I would go and have coffee with the president a couple of times a year. I had the finance minister's mobile phone number. I could phone him up. I had the central bank governor's mobile phone number. In 3 years in Beijing, I got inside the central bank once. Right, just once. So it's a completely different type of experience from that point of view. I mean, China's just a much harder nut to crack. In terms of the way people think about the countries, I mean, one of the things that always struck me was that this was a story I was telling Evan earlier. This kind of standard journalistic cliche in Brazil is to look at a big luxury shopping center and say, this is everything that's wrong with Brazil. Here's this rich, inward-looking, pampered elite that's going and buying Louis Vuitton goods, and that's why Brazil hasn't been successful, because you've got this very rich elite and these poor people, and they're not connected. The same journalists will then go to China and go into a shopping center and say, this is why China's so strong. Look at all the Louis Vuitton goods they're buying. You know, China's the country of the future. There's this consumer boom taking place. Look at the dynamism and energy. And so we tend to, you know, it's the weakness of journalists that we tend to take our preconceived ideas about these countries and impose them onto absolutely identical situations. Where the reality is that actually Brazil in the last 20 years has done very good things about reducing its inequality. And China, despite all its many, many successes on the economic front, has a very poor record in terms of inequality in particular. Brazil's going the right direction. The last couple of years it's gone rather badly. China has gone slowly but in the wrong direction.
Sounds like you might have been in China in the lead up to the Olympics. Any expectations about how Brazil might handle the Olympics?
So the thing about the Olympics is that we in the media, the Olympics or the World Cup, it was very similar to the World Cup in Brazil, we in the media, we always get grouchy about something in the few weeks beforehand. There's this kind of really nasty atmosphere for about 3 weeks beforehand where we're complaining about something that's going on. In Brazil, it was about delays and infrastructure improvements. And in China at the time, it was about, you know, are there going to be protests? And it was about the environment. We always fix on something, and we're always incredibly negative in the weeks leading up to these events. And then the sport starts, and you know what? We are total pushovers because it always looks good on TV, and then we just give up. And we move. You know, we're total suckers for these big events. As long as everything sort of works and it looks good on TV, then we're absolutely fine and we buy into it completely. So the mood, you know, from day 2 of all these events, the mood completely changes. And as long as Brazilians don't really mess up, and there are issues in Rio. Don't get me wrong. It's a difficult city to operate, and you know, the pollution in the places where the sailing and the canoeing are going to be are pretty scary. But as long as they don't really mess up, it's going to be absolutely fine. And it will, just as Beijing looked amazing during the Olympics, Rio will look absolutely amazing. I mean, there isn't a more photogenic city than Rio de Janeiro. So I think they'll probably be okay. But we will give them a very hard time for 3 weeks beforehand.
All right, last one.
Last question, please. Gentleman over here in the corner.
I'm just going to follow up on that. I was curious about the geopolitics, having lived in both places. Monroe Doctrine. How do people in Latin America see the relationship between U.S. and China's role in what we consider our backyard?
So
two very interesting points there, if I may. One is the Monroe Doctrine is a very interesting reference point to understand why China is actually having a hard time doing what it's doing at the moment. And Brazil is a very good example of that. And the Chinese might, though they actually don't articulate it, the Chinese officials don't articulate it, sometimes Chinese academics will say, all we're trying to do in Asia is do what you guys did in the Western Hemisphere in the 19th century. And the reason that's not sticking is the completely different context. And Brazil gives you the example. The Brazilian Senate from 1900 to 1960 met in a building called the Palacio Monroe. Monroe was very popular in lots of Latin America, at least in the first half of the 20th century. And the reason is that the Monroe Doctrine, even though it asserted American hegemony over the Western Hemisphere, it liberated Latin American countries from European colonialism. And so the very progressive bits of those countries actually appreciated the American presence, at least in the first half of the 20th century. Things got a bit rocky in the Cold War and Guatemala and Chile and all the rest of it. But for a long time they appreciated that because it gave them freedom from European colonialism. The Chinese context is totally different. The last thing that these other Asian countries want is to kick the US out and be dominated by China. So it's completely flipped. So even though the Chinese might think they're imposing a Monroe Doctrine, actually the context is totally different. What the Latin Americans think of China today, there certainly was a period, I think, you've had this extraordinary commodities boom from 2003 to 2012 that gave a decade of very high growth in Latin America. And that encouraged also a sense of political opportunity as well. And so you had a lot of these Latin American governments were trying to build up contacts in China. And not just the very left-wing ones, the Hugo Chavez and the Cubans, but also the Brazilians and the Argentines and Chileans and all sorts of governments. That commodities boom has ended, and so you're now seeing a reevaluation, I think, in these countries. They're realizing that they need new sources of growth, that actually the US market is one of the places they should be paying more attention to. And so politics is changing, I think, certainly in the southern bits of Latin America, where the countries are starting to think that actually we need to go back to our bacon. We need to understand that Europe and the US are places where we need to get more entry into their markets, more access into their markets, because China's not going to be for us in the way it has been for the last decade. And so they're becoming less interested in playing the China card. They still like the idea of a multilateral world, a world where the US isn't quite so dominant, and so they have good ties with China, but they're not enamored with the idea that China is the solution. China's going to resolve all their problems. China's their new big brother. On the contrary, they're realizing that they're going to have to go back and do business with the Yankees, I'm afraid.
All right. Hey, folks, it's been a great year. Geoff, you ended us on a high note.